World War II was the largest war in human history, and the Soviet-German front was its most brutal and savage theater. Here, tank columns rolled like floods of steel, infantry charges packed the battlefield, and artillery thundered across snow-covered plains. Soviet soldiers faced not only the fierce German offensive, but something even harder to endure than bullets: hunger. In the winter of 1941, many Soviet soldiers might receive just one bowl of thin porridge and a piece of hard, black bread so dense it sometimes contained sawdust. Yet by the later years of the war, those same soldiers could receive a tin of canned meat during rest periods, and even taste the sweetness of American condensed milk. Within just a few years, this contrast reflected not only the recovery of Soviet agricultural production, but also the shifting balance of military power between the Soviet Union and Germany. In this video, we'll talk about the rations of Soviet soldiers in World War II, looking at what ordinary Red Army soldiers ate during those grueling years, how they went from extreme scarcity in the beginning to gradual improvement, and how they ultimately fought all the way to Berlin. Pre-war agricultural background. Before we discuss Soviet wartime rations, we need to understand the agricultural situation in the Soviet Union at that time. Prior to World War II, Soviet agriculture went through an extremely violent upheaval during the 1930s. Starting in 1929, Stalin pushed forward agricultural collectivization, the policy of reorganizing the scattered small-scale rural economy into collective farms and state farms. This process was brutal, accompanied by mass grain seizures, forced coercion, and political campaigns against wealthy peasants known as kulaks. As a result, the Soviet Union experienced a severe food crisis in the early 1930s, particularly the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, which directly caused millions of deaths and a sharp drop in agricultural output. However, as collectivization gradually stabilized and the Soviet Union passed through this painful transition period, agricultural production began to grow rapidly in the late 1930s. According to statistics from that time, by 1937 the Soviet Union's total grain output had recovered and exceeded pre-collectivization levels, with significant increases in wheat, rye, and oats. In the Soviet countryside, potatoes were considered the second grain, and were grown extremely widely. Their yields also increased year by year in the late 1930s. These crops provided a stable source of staple food for the military. Beyond grain, meat and dairy production also improved in the later stages of collectivization. Although per capita meat consumption in the Soviet Union was limited, the state ensured basic nutritional guarantees for soldiers and urban workers through a system of priority allocation. In other words, ordinary peasants might not eat meat often, but there was a stable supply of meat in the bowls of Red Army soldiers. At the policy level, the Soviet Union implemented a system of state procurement and unified distribution. This meant that grain produced by collective farms was not freely distributed by the farmers themselves, but purchased by the state at fixed prices, and then redistributed to the military, factories, and urban residents. While this system was unfair to peasants, it was a major advantage for the military, because even in years of poor harvests, the state could guarantee that the military received food first. This reflects a key feature: Soviet agricultural policy was not centered on meeting market demand but was guided by national strategy. The military, heavy industry, and urban workers were the priority, while peasants were placed last. This distribution logic provided the institutional foundation for the Soviet Union to maintain basic rations for large-scale forces in the early period of the war. In concrete terms, in 1940, the year before the Soviet-German War began, the Soviet Union's grain output was 95.6 million tons, and potato output was 76.1 million tons. Based on the food supply situation at the time, this was fully sufficient to meet military needs. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was actively stockpiling strategic materials. At that point, Germany had already conquered most of Europe, Poland fell, France surrendered, and Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway all collapsed. The entire world was shrouded in the shadow of war. Although the Soviet Union and Germany had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, the Soviet government still established food and supply reserves to prepare for potential conflict. Major cities and strategic locations stockpiled several months to half a year's worth of grain, which later provided food security during the most difficult period, after war broke out in 1941. Pre-war ration standards. So how did this pre-war agricultural recovery and material stockpiling translate to soldiers' tables? According to ration supply standards issued by the Soviet Defense Committee, which clearly defined food allocations for different branches and ranks of the Red Army, ordinary infantry received the following daily rations. Bread, 800 grams, primarily rye bread, the Soviet staple. dense, sour in taste, but providing sufficient carbohydrates and calories. Potatoes, 500 grams, the most common side dish, appearing in virtually every meal. Meat, 150 grams, the specific type depended on local supply conditions. Vegetables, 320 grams, mainly cabbage, carrots, and onions, used for soups or stews. Grains, 170 grams, including buckwheat, oats, barley, cooked into porridge. Simple but filling. Lard, 50 grams. Sugar, 35 grams. While this standard was plain in taste, the nutritional structure was not bad, providing approximately 3,500 kilocalories per day, enough to sustain physical labor and daily training. But this was only the peacetime standard. Once war broke out, the stable supply on soldiers' tables would become extremely fragile. 1941, the collapse of rations. On June 22, 1941, when German forces launched Operation Barbarossa in the early morning hours, the Soviet Union's food reserves and logistics system instantly faced a massive shock, and soldiers' rations entered a turbulent period from extreme deterioration at first, then gradual recovery, and later improvement with Allied aid. At the outbreak of the Soviet-German War, Germany's sudden invasion caused the Soviet Union to lose vast fertile agricultural regions. Especially after the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Kiev, the fall of Ukraine stripped the Soviet Union of its most important breadbasket and supply zone. Within just a few months, the Soviet Union lost 40% of its grain-producing areas. More critically, many grain warehouses and reserves couldn't be evacuated in time and fell into German hands. Under these circumstances, frontline Soviet rations were rapidly cut. The original daily bread ration of 800 grams was forced down to 400 grams or less. Many soldiers could only receive a small piece of black bread plus a bowl of cabbage soup with almost no fat in it. Meat supply was nearly cut off, with protein coming only from small amounts of legumes or wild vegetables. The most common complaint in soldiers' memoirs from this period was simply, not enough to eat. Some units even had soldiers digging up roots and boiling tree bark in extreme situations. During the siege of Leningrad, with the city completely surrounded, soldiers and civilians could only survive on less than 200 grams of bread per day. Soldiers starving to death at their posts were countless. It was an era where even the most basic conditions for survival could not be guaranteed. Hunger, cold, and filth became soldiers' daily reality. 1942 to 1943, the turning point. The turning point in Soviet rations came in late 1942 to 1943. As the Soviet Union relocated its entire industrial and agricultural production system east of the Urals, a new food supply network was gradually established. At the same time, the German army suffered devastating losses at the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Soviet Union gradually seized the strategic initiative. During this period, Soviet ration standards partially recovered. The daily bread ration was raised back to 600 to 700 grams, and supplies of potatoes and grains gradually stabilized. Although meat was still scarce, the military began using large quantities of canned goods as substitutes. Soldiers could receive a little lard or meat broth, that long-missed sense of fat and oil made them feel full of energy. There was another important development during this stage. The Soviet Union also began following the German example and massively deploying field kitchens, mobile large cooking units that could quickly prepare porridge and soup on the front lines, providing soldiers with hot food. Although ingredients were still monotonous, even a bowl of hot porridge or a mouthful of hot soup in temperatures of -20 to 30 degrees Celsius could greatly boost morale. Worth noting is that starting in 1942, American Lend-Lease supplies also began arriving in the Soviet Union. Spam luncheon meat, powdered milk, sugar, and chocolate gradually appeared on Red Army soldiers' tables. Although quantities were limited and primarily supplied to frontline assault units, for the soldiers these foods were like gifts from heaven. Many veterans recalled that the first time they ate American luncheon meat, the smell of it remained vivid in their memories for many years afterward. By this stage, Soviet soldiers' rations had escaped the starvation line. At least they wouldn't go hungry, and could even eat hot porridge and canned goods. 1944 to 1945, victory rations. As the war entered 1944, the Soviet Union had firmly seized the strategic initiative. Soviet forces launched Operation Bagration, launching large-scale counteroffensives against German forces. With the liberation of agricultural heartlands in Ukraine and Belarus, vast quantities of grain and livestock were once again incorporated into the Soviet supply network. Grain output rose significantly, black bread supply became more stable, and some units even got white bread. Agricultural products gradually became more plentiful. Cabbage, beets, carrots, and potatoes were no longer scarce. The soup pot finally had real thick soup, instead of just a few leaves floating in hot water. Compared to earlier monotonous rations, from 1944 to 1945 Soviet soldiers' diets had become relatively diverse. Staples, black bread and white bread. Side dishes, cabbage soup, potato stew with meat, grain porridge. Meat, pork, canned goods, fish, canned goods, and even freshly slaughtered beef and mutton. Sweets, chocolate, candy, and jam. Drinks, vodka as a daily ration. Overall, soldiers' rations were now fairly comprehensive. Especially as Soviet forces advanced into Poland, Hungary, and eventually into German territory itself, their food conditions made a qualitative leap, because soldiers could directly seize food from local areas or requisition grain. German milk, eggs, sausage, beer, and bread became common external supplies encountered along the way. Many Soviet soldiers tasted German sausage and beer for the first time. Some units, when billeted, could even eat whole roasted suckling pigs, for better food than they had in the Soviet homeland. This situation wasn't universal, but it genuinely gave some frontline units remarkably lavish food conditions. This improvement in rations not only met soldiers' nutritional needs, but also gave them enormous psychological encouragement. After all, being able to eat a few decent meals before the war ended, after years of bloody combat, was itself a symbol of victory. Iconic Soviet military foods. Black bread, Kyrny Kleb/Kyorna Liba. The first is black bread, but this is completely different from German black bread. Soviet black bread has an unpleasant texture, sour and hard. People tasting it for the first time often find it difficult to swallow. But for soldiers, it had two irreplaceable advantages. First, high caloric density. Because of its density, a small piece could provide considerable energy to sustain prolonged physical exertion. Second, excellent shelf life. Unlike white bread, it doesn't spoil easily. Black bread can be preserved longer in damp and cold conditions. On the front lines where meat and vegetables were chronically lacking, black bread was the most stable energy source for Soviet soldiers. When no other food was available, chewing a piece of dry bread could get you through the day. In the early period of the Soviet-German War, due to extreme food shortages, Soviet black bread was often adulterated, sawdust, and wood shavings mixed into the rye flour. This bread was as hard as a stone, requiring tremendous effort to chew. In winter, frozen black bread was so hard it could be used like a brick, or stuffed inside a coat as improvised armor against bullets. But even so, Soviet soldiers treasured it. Whether in the trenches on the march or during the intervals of fierce combat, it was almost the only food that could fill their stomachs. Tushenka, canned meat. If black bread was the most common staple, then Tushenka was the most popular side dish. Tushenka is a Soviet-style canned meat, typically made with beef or pork as the base, combined with onions, carrots, pepper, and other seasonings, stewed and then sealed in metal cans through high-temperature sterilization. It is rich in fat and is a high-protein, high-calorie food, easy to transport and carry, making it a key ration for sustaining strength during long marches and frontline combat. On the front lines, Tushenka was almost a luxury because meat was extremely scarce during wartime, making canned meat particularly precious. Soldiers would often mix Tushenka into thin porridge, instantly turning an ordinary meal fragrant and satisfying. Before the war, the Soviet Union had already pre-produced 450 million cans of Tushenka for temporary use. But after the war began, the Soviets never imagined how rapidly the Germans would advance. The canned food factories and warehouses in the Western Soviet Union were largely captured by German forces, and all those carefully prepared meat cans became German war trophies, eaten with great satisfaction by the Germans. By 1943, Soviet canned food production had almost ground to a halt due to war destruction. At this point, thanks to the help of their ally the United States, American food factories took on Soviet Tushenka production orders under the Lend-Lease program, following Soviet recipes, but using American manufacturing techniques, producing similar canned meat that continuously reached frontline Soviet soldiers' tables. Throughout World War II, the United States produced approximately 2 billion cans of Tushenka for the Soviet Union. Vodka. Beyond black bread and Tushenka, the most distinctly Soviet element was of course vodka. We all know Russians have a serious love of alcohol. Even in peacetime, the streets regularly featured people stumbling around drunk. In wartime it was no different. Vodka is Russia's most famous spirit, generally at 56 to 60% alcohol content. The vodka supplied to the military was at 40%. After swallowing it, there's a burning sensation like flames going down the throat. Drinking it can briefly numb the nerves and ease fear. Vodka served three purposes on the front lines. Warding off cold. In combat conditions of -30 to 40 degrees Celsius, a small sip of vodka could stimulate blood circulation and produce a feeling of warmth. Disinfection and disease prevention. In conditions of scarce supplies and unclean food, vodka could serve as basic sterilization, particularly helping to reduce gastrointestinal illness when food was irregular. Psychological support. The tension, fear, and exhaustion of the battlefield were an enormous mental trial for soldiers. Vodka could briefly relieve stress, giving soldiers a moment of relaxation amid artillery fire and hunger. So for Soviet soldiers, vodka was absolutely an essential morale booster. In Soviet units, you could be without meat, but not without alcohol. On August 22, 1941, 2 months after the Great Patriotic War began, Stalin personally approved an order stipulating that frontline soldiers could receive 100 grams of vodka per day. This played a positive role in boosting the combat effectiveness of frontline units. Many Soviet soldiers would carry a bottle of vodka close to their chest for courage, and before going into battle they would drink down whatever remained in one gulp. With the alcohol taking effect, their minds would go blank, and they would charge at German forces through a hail of bullets, displaying a fearless and reckless bravery. Throughout the long years of wartime combat, vodka was not only a beverage but a battlefield culture and symbol of willpower, practically becoming the spiritual ration of Soviet soldiers. Conclusion: World War II was a contest of steel and blood, but ultimately what sustained hundreds of millions of soldiers was the most ordinary of foods. The sourness of black bread, the richness of Tushenka, the sharpness of vodka, these seemingly plain flavors were tightly interwoven with the blood and sweat of Soviet soldiers. Soviet military rations went from extreme scarcity in the early war, to gradual recovery in the middle period, to completeness and abundance in the later stages. The changes on soldiers' tables were actually a reflection of the changing battlefield situation in World War II. The sudden drop in bread and potatoes represented the loss of vast Soviet territory. The appearance of American canned goods and chocolate reflected the arrival of international alliance and aid. And when soldiers raised glasses of vodka in the streets of Berlin to cheer, it was not just a glass of spirits, it was a declaration of victory. Perhaps in the history books, more people remember great battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. But for ordinary frontline soldiers, their most vivid memories were often simply, could we eat enough? War is not only the roar of tanks and cannons, it also encompasses the everyday reality of rice and salt. It was precisely these ordinary foods that sustained an army's willpower through countless brutal days and nights, helping Soviet soldiers endure the most difficult moments and witnessing the turning point from the edge of disaster to ultimate victory, along with the entire nation's food production system and logistics supply capability.